Hello and welcome to all the men and women of the West, and happy Hobbit Day and well met, my friends. For our Hobbit Day video in this magnificent collab series, we, the brothers Kryn, decided to recount the life story of Bilbo Baggins in history podcast format. Hope you all enjoy it. 120 years after the fall of the Lonely Mountain to the dragon Smaug, born on September 22nd, 2890 of the Third Age, into an age of increasing strife and chaos and darkness, Bilbo Baggins is a figure unlike any other. Sly, witty, and formidable, Bilbo was the son of Bungo Baggins and Belladonna Took. Through the latter, the grandson of the old Took, an almost legendary figure throughout the Shire. Bilbo was thus heir to quite the legacy, and though it was nothing compared to the legacy of his later day traveling companion Thorin Oakenshield, it was still by the standards of the Shire quite respectable. As a child, he was to enjoy parties and indulging his endless appetite for food, just as all other child hobbits do. Where he stood out was in how much he enjoyed Gandalf's firework displays, tales of princesses, and of course dragons. By far more imaginative than any other youth his age, Bilbo at the time caught the eye of Gandalf, who noted the hobbit's awe towards his magical feats. Bilbo's first real hurdle wasn't one, though, that many fans really take much note of. It's one that tends to be little more than a footnote in the estimation of even the most passionate of Tolkien fans. What I'm referring to is the Fell Winter. This terrible winter was not as long as the Long Winter that preceded it by quite some time, but was certainly no easy thing to survive. The trouble for the Shire was that while it was not filled with wicked men or with goblins, it was deadly primarily because of the wolves that entered its vicinity and in the starvation that very nearly resulted throughout the region. Thankfully, the hobbits had a protector in the form of Gandalf, who rallied the rangers of Arnor, who helped by providing food. Bilbo was to, in time, bury his mother and father long after this winter, so that he inherited Bag End. In time, he settled quite nicely into life at Bag End, a life that consisted of eating, sleeping, eating, gardening, eating, writing, eating, sleeping, smoking pipeweed, eating. And have I mentioned eating yet? Oh, and by the way, he did a lot of eating during his life in Bag End. It was a good time for Bilbo. He generally didn't want for anything, especially in regards to food, and was pretty merry. Much more so than, say, a bunch of dwarves who were to drop onto his doorstep eventually. Speaking of his adventures, how's about we get to that part of the story? As just talking about his meals is getting a little ridiculous. So let's talk about his fateful meal with a bunch of dwarves. It happened that the night after he invited Gandalf the Grey over for some tea, the old man, who had taken the time to vandalize Bilbo's door, thus committing what was likely a felony in the Shire, followed this crime up by joining in on some trespassing alongside a good dozen dwarves. Throughout the meal, the dwarves unwittingly engaged in terrorizing the hobbit, of whom they were rather unimpressed with. Who could blame them? He wasn't what Gandalf had told them he'd be. Little did they know that there was much more to him than meets the eye. The next day, hounded out the door by Gandalf, Bilbo joined the dwarves, if reluctantly so, on their journey to the Lonely Mountain. This journey was the first one that any hobbit had taken so far out of the Shire, at least for quite some time. Likely, though, Bilbo's adventures took him further than even the old Took had gone. The first destination of the company was a place that many hobbits had indeed seen and been to, with it being the Green Dragon. From there, they continued until they encountered a trio of brutish trolls. What followed was a complete series of disasters on the part of the dwarves and Bilbo, worthy of any D&D session, with Gandalf swooping in to save them, in spite of his own pressing quest that was pulling him elsewhere. The trolls were swiftly dispensed with by Gandalf, who bought time, as all know, with the old wizard keen to push onwards. The company was to reach Rivendell, or Imladris, as it was also known, in June, with the elves mocking the dwarves blatantly until they were bursting with irritation at the humiliating songs that were thrown their way. Humorously, the map of Thorin's forefathers that Gandalf had on hand, and that had dwarf moon letters painted onto it, were noticed and read first by Elrond, with the Maiar having never truly noticed them before, so that there was plenty of humiliation to go around. While the dwarves and Gandalf were rather annoyed by this time, the hobbit was quite impressed by his surroundings. It was likely during this visit that Bilbo first truly became rather awed and smitten with the great house of Elrond. his affection for the half-elf's home was to never quite dissipate, and he was to, during his many stays there in the future, learn a great many tales that he was to copy into his Red Book, and awe his nephew Frodo and the younger hobbits friends with those same tales, so that his love for the elves was passed down also. Departing for the Misty Mountains, which provided the most direct route to the Lonely Mountain, the company was soon ambushed, however, by goblins, who had taken refuge underground below the mountains. So make a note if ever you want to travel there. As to the would-be victims in this case, Gandalf managed to elude the goblins, but the dwarves and Bilbo were another matter, with the old man proving himself capable of far more than vandalizing one's property by rescuing the majority of the company. Stumbling about in the dark, it happened that Bilbo had become separated from his companions, and soon became lost. What followed was something almost out of a Norse saga, as he stumbled his way into Gollum's hideaway, deep below the mountains, where even the goblins never tended to tread. It was whilst he was down there that Bilbo found himself a ring, which had a tendency to inspire in folks a strange sense of dibs. Worse than anything Barney Stinson could possibly imagine. When it came to this ring, though, neither Gollum nor Bilbo knew it, but it was the very ring that had brought about the doom of Isildur. What followed was an interesting little riddle battle, which ended in Bilbo inadvertently cheating, then escaping from the blood-crazed, cannibalistic mountain-dwelling fellow, who, screaming Baggins, louder than Pete screaming Goof in Goof Troop, was to take to the road for the next couple of decades in search of his precious. As to Bilbo Baggins, after he had escaped Gollum, the goblins, and the Misty Mountain, was reunited with his buddies, lied to them about his escape, like any true friend would, and proceeded to engage in his new hobby that was near-death situations and narrow escapes, as the local wargs, that is to say, demonic wolves, and goblins, cornered the company near a couple of trees, at which point the local giant eagles decided to serve as a get-out-of-danger-free card and escort the group out of there. Dropped off not far, though at a safe distance, the dwarves were to soon thereafter meet Beorn, who was to permit them to stay the night in his home, with Gandalf taking off on his own at about this time. Full of trepidation, the company entered Mirkwood and tried to cross the Enchanted River, which, unlike the Undying Lands, did not suffer from false advertising. To understand this joke, check out our Farazan video. Now, this river was enchanted, with the company warned not to take a dip. So naturally, Bomber proceeded to do more than just that and bungled his way into the waters halfway across the river. Falling into an enchanted sleep, Bomber was to forget all about the warnings given to the group by Gandalf and Beorn. In turn, though, the rest of the group demonstrated a pretty poor memory for warnings shortly thereafter, as they sought to approach the elves that lived in Mirkwood. Doing so 3 times, they were to, however, lose track of said elves and Bilbo Baggins, who briefly fell asleep, so that the hobbit awoke just as a large spider was trying to turn him into lunch. Something that the middle-aged hobbit really didn't much care for. Naturally, Bilbo did what any self-respecting burglar might. He saved himself. This done, he then went on to rescue his companions from the other spiders, all while singing a couple of clever ditties, with his rescue of his friends due entirely to his wielding of the One Ring of Sauron. The children of Shelob, for they must have been her children, soon became frustrated and disgusted with the challenge of trying to catch him and were pushed back by the furious dwarves, who did not much appreciate nearly being made into mincemeat. Reunited, the company soon noticed that Thorin was missing, kind of the most important member of their team, and departing in search of him, worried for his safety, they were soon caught once again, though this time by the Wood Elves. Thorin, for his part, had been taken prisoner by Thranduil, who soon imprisoned the heir of the Lonely Mountain companions with similar promptness. In turn, Bilbo was to survive for quite some time thanks to the One Ring and his superior cunning, exploiting the depths of the Elvish palace with keen interest. After some time, he would make his move and free the dwarves, much to their joy, though they were initially bewildered by his invisibility and impressed by his skills. The next move to be made was to secure barrels for the dwarves to escape in, as the elves were in the midst of a rather large and excited celebration, and were thus preoccupied with that most important of Irish sports, binge drinking. This wasn't all that difficult, so that the dwarves drifted safely downstream from the city and were to be pulled out by Bilbo. Dizzied and a little waterlogged, the dwarves hastily thanked the most valuable member of their company ere they approached Lake Town. The elves had been surprised by the discovery of dwarves near their home. It was as nothing compared to the residents of Lake Town. Once their astonishment had disappeared, the people regarded the dwarves with barely repressed hope and relief. Having long suffered under the fear of destruction at the hands of the dragon Smaug and denied their traditional home city of the Dale, they were swift to supply the dwarves with all that they might need on the road to take down the terrible worm. Bilbo, for his part, might well have preferred to stay in the village, yet he was dragged along as the dwarves had long since come to value him as the most invaluable member of their company and had all but adopted him. The company, thus in mixed spirits, made their way up the lonely mountain, so that they sat on its side, with most whining amongst themselves over what ought to be done. Thereupon they decided that Bilbo should be the one to slip into the mountain and rid them of the dragon. The secret door into Smaug's nest was soon discovered shortly thereafter, so that the company slipped into a hidden hallway within the mountain. Bilbo was soon pressed forward into the nest proper to confront Smaug.
Problem was that as clever as Bilbo was, Smaug was all the more cunning in some ways, so that the dragon was to come close to tricking the hobbit into turning upon his friends, with this being how he partially discovered the whereabouts of the aforementioned company. There were two minor problems that occurred thence for the wicked worm. First being that the burglar had discovered and swiped the Arkenstone. The second problem was that, rather touchingly, the dwarves, rather than betray Bilbo, as they had never thought of it, chose to renew their vows to reward him. In response, Smaug, unknowing of the continued fraternal bond of the company, was to destroy a part of the mountain to get to them. Convinced that he had done them all in, Smaug was to take off to destroy Lake Town, setting the town ablaze in an act of pure hatred and cruelty. Convinced that there was none who could interfere with his quest for vengeance, Smaug was rather, to his and everyone's surprise, run into trouble when a single bird that had discovered the secrets of Smaug's weakness from eavesdropping on Bilbo brought this invaluable information. The hero bard was to strike down the dragon, who perished as suddenly as he took off from the lonely mountain. Celebrated as Dragon Slayer, Bard was to be elevated by popular vote to the rank of king by the people of Lake Town, just as the elves under Thranduil arrived to press his own claim to the riches contained within the lonely mountain. Seized by pity, the previously greedy monarch was to provide what he could for the assistance of the stricken citizens, unaware of all that had taken place downhill from them. The company explored the depths of the mountain in a desperate scramble to lay claim to all that was contained within it. Disappointed when he failed to find the Arkenstone, Thorin was to darken as a person, corrupted by a sickness that had its origin in Smaug himself, which had spread throughout all the treasures within the mountains, and from there into the dwarves they were to when the time came for the alliance forces of the two kings refused to treat with them. Annoyed, Thorin sent out bird messengers to fetch his cousin Dane Ironfoot, the finest commander he could call for, and set about preparing for a siege. It was with this rapidly declining situation on the doorsteps of the dwarves' realm that Bilbo, after commiserating with the miserable and lovable Bomber, set out secretly for the enemy encampment, where he decided to barter for the safety of the dwarves he had come to love ever so much. Joined by Gandalf, he was to offer up the Arkenstone in the hopes that Thorin might be willing to pay for the damages to the residents of Lake Town, with the kings in question awed by the hobbits' courage and loyalty, and refusal to stay with them. Though he knew it could mean death, Bilbo preferred to return to his friends. With the jewel in question duly presented to Thorin, and the demands laid out, whereupon the apoplectic monarch came very near to throwing down the poor hobbit. Stricken, Bilbo was saved by Gandalf speaking out in defense, and the small sliver of love for him that still existed in Thorin's heart. The situation could not get any worse, or so most probably thought, as the goblins from the Misty Mountains had begun to gather together a great force, and had decided, when they heard of Smaug's death, to hurry forth to try to seize his wealth and to slaughter all present. The battle that ensued was a desperate affair worthy of the many battles fought in the War of the One Ring, dubbed the Battle of the Five Armies. It involved on one side the armies of Dane, Thranduil, and Bard against the forces of the orcs. Seeing that Bilbo and Gandalf, along with all of the people of Lake Town, was likely to be in danger, the dwarves pressed for Thorin to lead them into battle. True to his noble spirit, the king under the mountain did exactly as his friends and kin begged him to. He could never allow Bilbo and Gandalf, after all they had done for him, to die when he could save them. Charging into the enemy midst, he was to achieve such glory that he was, generations later, still revered for his bravery and valor. Thorin found not only eternal fame upon the battlefield, but also his own demise, and that of his nephews, Fili and Kili. As to the heroic Alliance armies, they were to be rescued at the last minute by the Fifth Army, that of the Eagles. After the battle, Bilbo, who had been knocked out whilst he wore the One Ring, was retrieved and was to share one last heartbreaking farewell with his dear friend Thorin. The king was to beg his forgiveness, and once he had it, he would bemoan how he had not better appreciated fine drink, good food. Crowned king after Thorin, Dane was to see to his last will and testament by repaying the people of Lake Town and the elves along with the Eagles, returning home via generally the same route that he had taken to get to the Lonely Mountain. Bilbo, now a fabulously wealthy gent, was discovered that his home had been raided and plundered by a great many of his neighbors and kinsmen, most notably the Sackville Baggins.
After he had repurchased the vast majority of his possessions, Bilbo was to set about putting his affairs in better order, and to a variety of trips throughout the Shire and to Rivendell. It was in the years after his adventures that Bilbo was to take in the orphan Frodo. Frodo was his cousin, and had, after the tragic death of his parents, been left bereft, so that Bilbo took pity upon him, and took him out of Buckland Hall. Adored, Frodo was to grow up to become the apple of Bilbo's eye. It was not simply Frodo, though, that Bilbo poured his undying fatherly love upon, but also a number of his heirs' relatives, ranging from Merry to Pippin, and also to his gardener Gamgee's son, Samwise, who was to become Frodo's closest and dearest friend. This was not what attracted attention, though, nor was Bilbo's peculiar nature, which grew ever more tookish with each passing year, nor was it his occasional adventures to Imladris, but rather his continued youthfulness that served to alarm his neighbors and people, who either came to respect him all the more than before, or begrudged him his seeming eternal youth. Most of all, though, Bilbo poured his time into his scholarly and poetical pursuits, which were many and incredibly vast, so he swiftly became the greatest of all the Third Age scholars, with his time in Bag End, though, drawing to a close around his 111th birthday. A celebration he long planned, he was to show more magnificence and displays of wealth than ever before in all the history of the Shire. To cap his celebrations, though, he was to suddenly press the One Ring upon his finger and escape after mocking his guests at some length. Covering for his escape, Gandalf was to corner the Hobbit at Bag End, and after a lengthy and difficult test of wills, he at last convinced his dear friend to abandon the One Ring.
As all of you dear listeners well know, that none had turned away from the One Ring before, so that Bilbo showed a remarkable force of will by leaving it behind.
Tune on his lips, Bilbo, now liberated from the burden of the ring, made his way to Elrond's house. It was there he was to spend his remaining years before the War of the One Ring, with it being Bilbo who saw to making Frodo feel comfortable upon his arrival in Rivendell. It was also him who saw to the many needs during their stay. He offered much counsel and wisdom in the counsels that were to follow, and while he volunteered to once again take up the burden of the One Ring in an effort to spare his adoptive son the burden and horrors of war, it was not to be. he had grown too old for such a task, and too attached to the ring by extension. While the war was fought, Bilbo was left to ruminate his long life and over what possible fate might befall his surrogate children. It happened that he was to feel the effects of the destruction of the ring first between him, Frodo, and Sam. Aging rapidly, Bilbo was to 2 years after the war celebrate his 131st birthday before he sailed west, where he was to, after a very long and fruitful life, pass on. Bilbo's legacy was a vast one. For the Shire, he became essentially Santa Claus for the children, and known to the adult hobbits as Mad Baggins, and something of a cautionary tale regarding wanderlust. To his surrogate children, he remained dear, with Sam even naming his 10th child after Bilbo. But for Middle-earth, Baggins was both a hero and a scholar, one whom had retrieved the ring from darkness only to safely pass it on to Frodo, so that in this way he played a key role in its destruction. His scholarly works were to later become known as the Red Book of Westmarch, which cemented his scholarly legacy forevermore.
If you enjoyed this retelling, don't forget to smash that like and subscribe button as though you were Sauron seeking to smash Gil-galad into itty-bitty pieces.